The first time I added it all up, I laughed. A short, sharp sound, more like a bark of surprise than any real amusement. Then, almost immediately, I cried. Not loud, sobbing tears, just a quiet, steady stream that I didn't bother to wipe away. They traced paths down my cheeks, a warm contrast to the cold realization settling in my chest. And then, after the laughter and the tears had cleared, I realized they'd never loved me for who I was, just for what I gave. My name is Grace Holloway. For 15 years, I was the backbone of our family's foundation, the Holloway Educational Trust. I was the financial officer, the one who balanced the books, who made sure the grants went out, who smoothed over the inconsistencies, quietly funding everyone else's dreams, their visions, their urgent needs. I told myself it was noble. I told myself it was duty. I thought loyalty was enough. I thought being useful, indispensable even, meant being loved, valued, seen. I was wrong. So profoundly, devastatingly wrong. And when they asked me for $60,000 more, just like that, over a Sunday roast, I finally said no. If you've ever been the one who gave everything only to realize you were never seen, if you've ever felt that hollow ache of being taken for granted, not just by strangers, but by the very people who should have cherished you, stay till the end. This story, it's for you. It was a Sunday like so many others. Late afternoon sun slanting through the dining room window, catching the dust motes dancing in the air. The scent of my mother's rosemary chicken, a smell so familiar it was practically woven into my childhood memories, usually brought a sense of comfort. But not that day. Not anymore. The table was set with the good china, the one reserved for family, though lately, family felt more like a board meeting I couldn't resign from. My mother, Eleanor, was at the head of the table, a slight smile playing on her lips as she surveyed her domain. My sister, Clara, younger by 5 years, all vibrant energy and fleeting passions, was detailing her latest triumph with one of the scholarship programs she nominally managed at the trust. And the city councilor was just so impressed, he said our outreach is a model for the state. Clara beamed, her eyes flicking to me, then back to Mother. I nodded, a small non-committal sound. I knew the actual numbers for that program. The outreach was aspirational, the model still very much in beta. But I'd learned long ago that my role at these dinners was to listen, to affirm, not to correct. My corrections, my data-driven realities, were reserved for the sterile environment of my office at the trust, where they were usually met with sighs and requests to just make it work. Grace. Mother placed her fork down with a delicate clink. That's wonderful, dear. Truly. And speaking of the program's success, she paused, her gaze settling on me, a little too bright, a little too hopeful. Here it comes, I thought. The air in the room seemed to thin, the comfortable background hum of family life fading to a pinpoint. There's just a tiny shortfall. For the spring cohort. Nothing major, but we wouldn't want to lose momentum, would we? Clara chimed in, her voice oozing practiced concern. It's 60,000, Grace. We've stretched everything, but the caterer for the awards luncheon went up, and there were some unexpected printing costs for the new brochures. You know how it is. $60,000. Said as easily as if it were 60. I felt a familiar tightening in my chest. This was the rhythm of our lives. A project, an idea, a need, always theirs. And then the call, the email, the casual dinner request, always to me. 4 years, I'd been the family's, and by extension the trust's unofficial, interest-free line of credit. My inheritance from my father, carefully invested, had become their emergency fund. My own savings, earmarked for a quiet life, a little place of my own someday, were constantly being diverted. I see, I said. My voice sounded distant, even to my own ears. My thick brown hair, always tied back in a sensible knot, suddenly felt too tight, pulling at my scalp. My gray eyes, which I knew often looked tired, probably looked exhausted now. I could feel their expectant gazes. Mother's soft and pleading. Clara's a little more demanding, a touch impatient beneath the veneer of camaraderie. This was the part where I was supposed to sigh, maybe ask a few token questions about where else they'd looked for funding, knowing they hadn't, not really, and then agree. Agree to stretch myself, my finances, my future a little thinner once again. But something inside me, something that had been slowly fracturing for months, maybe years, finally snapped. It wasn't a loud break, more like a quiet internal click. The sound of a lock disengaging. "No," I said. The word hung in the air, small and stark. Felt foreign on my tongue. Silence. Not just a pause in conversation, but a heavy, stunned silence that pressed down on us. The clinking of cutlery from the kitchen, where Mrs. Albright was clearing plates, suddenly sounded deafening. Mother's smile froze, then slowly dissolved. Clara's jaw tightened, a flicker of disbelief, then annoyance in her eyes. "No," Clara repeated, as if I'd spoken in a different language. "Grace, what do you mean, no? This is for the kids. For their education." The unspoken accusation. "How could you be so selfish?" "I mean, no," I said, my voice steadier this time, though my heart was hammering. "I can't cover it. The trust's budget is set for the year. And I won't be covering it personally." Mother finally spoke, her voice a low tremor. "Grace, darling, perhaps you're not understanding. This is important. It's our legacy. Our legacy built on my money, my quiet, unending contributions." The irony was a bitter taste in my mouth. I looked at them, really looked at them. At my mother, who always knew the right emotional lever to pull. At my sister, who had always skated through life on charm and my financial safety net. And I saw with a clarity that was both painful and liberating, that they didn't see me. They saw a resource, a means to an end. The silence stretched, taut and uncomfortable. The delicious aroma of rosemary chicken now seemed cloying. The hurt was a dull ache, deep in my bones. The isolation profound. I was in a room with my family, the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally, and I had never felt more alone. The shock wasn't just theirs. It was mine too. Shock at my own audacity. Shock at the coldness that was already creeping into their eyes. This, I realized, was the cost of being the responsible one. And the price for finally saying no. I was only just beginning to understand what that might be. That dinner ended quickly after that. Awkwardly. The warmth had leached from the room, replaced by a glacial chill. I think I mumbled something about an early start, and no one tried to stop me when I left. Driving home that night, the familiar Vermont roads felt different, lonelier. The quiet hum of my car's engine was the only sound accompanying the turmoil in my head. The next day, I didn't go into the trust. I called in sick, something I almost never did. I needed space. I needed to think. That no echoed in my mind, not with regret, but with a strange sense of finality. And with it, a question began to form, insidious and persistent. Just how much had I given? Over all these years. It started as a morbid curiosity, I suppose. A way to process the shock of that dinner. I sat at my small desk in my quiet apartment, the gray morning light filtering through the window. I opened my laptop, pulled up my banking software, my old financial planners, dusty folders of receipts I'd meticulously kept because, well, I'm a financial officer. It's what I do. I decided to go back 15 years, to when I first received the bulk of my father's inheritance, the nest egg that was supposed to be for my future. The age of 25. When I just started at the trust, full of naive idealism, and a desperate need to prove my worth to my family. The first entry was for Clara. $10,000. A loan for a deposit on her first apartment after college. A loan that was never spoken of again, let alone repaid. I remembered her tearful call, the drama, how I'd felt like a hero swooping in. Next, a larger sum, $25,000. For Mother. Just a little something to tide the household over, she'd said. After a particularly bad investment my late stepfather had made before he passed. It was meant to be temporary. It became permanent. Then there was the $50,000 for my older brother, David, who wasn't at the dinner, who lived out of state and communicated mostly through requests for funds for his perpetually failing startups. That one had particularly stung. He'd promised shares in a company that never materialized. On and on it went. University tuition top-ups for Clara's master's degree she never finished. Emergency repairs on mother's sprawling ancestral home. The new roof, the upgraded heating system, the landscaping because appearances matter, grace, especially for the trust's image. There were smaller amounts too, hundreds here, a few thousand there. For things I barely remembered, a designer dress for Clara for a gala, a cultural trip for mother to Italy. Each transaction, a line item in a ledger of sacrifice I hadn't consciously been keeping, but which my bank statements recorded with brutal, emotionless accuracy. The hours ticked by. The coffee grew cold beside me. I didn't eat. I just tallied. I cross-referenced. I remembered. Each number I typed into the spreadsheet wasn't just a figure. It was a piece of my life, a piece of my future, willingly, unquestioningly handed over. It was the down payment on a house I never bought for myself, the investments I never made for my own retirement, the trips I never took, the quiet, simple life I'd always dreamed of, deferred again and again. And the bitterness. Oh, it started as a faint taste like unripe fruit, then grew acrid and consuming. Regret wasn't far behind, not just for the money but for my own blindness. For the years I'd spent believing that my worth was tied to my utility, that if I just gave enough, carried enough, fixed enough, they would finally truly love me for me, not for what I could provide. That core belief, the one I'd clung to for so long. If I carry enough, they'll love me for it. It was crumbling. Watching those numbers climb, I saw with sickening clarity that they didn't see my care as love. They saw it as currency, an expectation, my duty. By late afternoon, the spreadsheet was complete. I stared at the final sum at the bottom of the column. It was staggering. Far more than the $60,000 Clara had so casually requested. It was a sum that represented a significant portion of everything I had. A sum that could have given me a completely different life. I leaned back in my chair, a hollow feeling in my stomach. The awakening was brutal. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the profound imbalance, the years of one-sided giving, the slow erosion of my own self for their comfort and convenience. The silence in my apartment was heavy, but it was different from the silence at the dinner table. This silence was mine, and in it something new was taking root. Not anger, not yet. Something colder. A sense of resolve. The responsible one was finally counting the cost. And it was far, far too high. The verbal no at dinner had been impulsive, a gut reaction. But after that day spent staring at the stark numbers on my screen, I knew I needed to make it formal, official. I couldn't just let it hang there, an awkward moment they might try to smooth over, to guilt me out of later. So, the next morning I composed an email. I addressed it to Mother and Clara, as heads of the relevant departments within the trust, and also in their capacity as well family. I kept it brief, professional. I stated that, further to our conversation, I would not be providing the $60,000 for the scholarship program shortfall. I mentioned that the trust's approved budget needed to be adhered to, and that personal contributions of that magnitude were no longer something I could, or would, make. I reread it several times. My finger hovered over the send button. There was a tremor in my hand, a knot of anxiety in my stomach. This wasn't just an email, it was a declaration. A line drawn in the sand after years of letting them walk all over me. I hit send. The little whoosh sound from my computer felt disproportionately loud in the quiet of my apartment. The response wasn't immediate, which surprised me. I'd expected a flurry of calls, texts. But the day passed in a strange, suspended quiet. I actually managed to focus on some of my own neglected freelance accounting work, tasks I did on the side to supplement my modest trust salary. A salary, I now realized with a fresh pang, that had never truly reflected my responsibilities or the financial burdens I carried for them. The call came the next evening. It was Mother. Her voice was thick with unshed tears, a carefully calibrated quaver that I knew from long experience was designed to elicit maximum guilt. "Grace, darling," she began, her tone wounded. I received your email. I don't understand. After everything we've done, everything this family stands for." I listened, my own emotions carefully walled off. The old Grace would have crumbled, would have started apologizing, explaining, trying to make it better. But the Grace who had stared at that spreadsheet, who had seen the sum total of her sacrifices, just listened. "There's nothing to understand, Mother," I said, my voice calm, even. "I've made my decision. The trust needs to operate within its means. And so do I. But it's just 60,000, she said, the tears now audibly falling. "For the children, Grace. How can you be so unfeeling?" Unfeeling. That was rich. After years of feeling everything for everyone else, of absorbing their anxieties, their financial missteps, their endless needs. I didn't say that, of course. I just repeated, "My decision is final." There was a choke sob, then the line went dead. No goodbye. Just the click. A few days later, Clara made her move. Not directly, of course. Clara preferred the indirect approach. Vague, poignant quotes started appearing on her social media. Things like, "It's sad when people you thought were family turn out to be driven only by greed." And, "True generosity comes from the heart, not the wallet. Some people just don't understand that." Each one was a little passive-aggressive dart aimed, I knew, squarely at me. Friends, mutual acquaintances, probably even some trust donors would see them. They were designed to paint me as the villain, the cold-hearted, money-obsessed sister who had suddenly, inexplicably, turned her back on her loving family and their noble cause. And then silence. Complete silence. No more calls from Mother. No texts from Clara, not even angry ones. No invitations to Sunday dinner. No casual check-ins. It was as if a switch had been flipped. I was out. Cut off. Excommunicated for the sin of saying no. The liberation was undeniable. A weight I hadn't fully realized I was carrying had lifted. My shoulders felt lighter. My days felt like my own for the first time in years. I could breathe. But alongside that liberation, a profound loneliness settled in. This was my family. For all their faults, for all the dysfunction, they were mine. Or so I had thought. The ease with which they had excised me was a brutal confirmation of what I'd begun to suspect. My value to them had indeed been purely transactional. There was uncertainty, too. My role at the trust, my financial livelihood, was now precarious. I was still officially the financial officer, but I felt like a ghost in their machine. How long before they found a way to push me out completely? The quiet satisfaction of my no was real, but so was the dawning awareness of the solitude it had bought me. I was an island, and the tide was going out, leaving me starkly, unequivocally alone. I had drawn my line, and they had simply chosen to stand on the other side of it, without a backward glance. The price of that first real no was becoming clearer. It was the price of my family. A couple of weeks passed in this strange new reality. The silence from my family remained absolute. Work at the trust was awkward. Meetings were stilted. Clara would barely look at me, and Mother communicated only through terse, formal emails about essential business. I knew my position was becoming untenable, but I was determined not to be the one to break. I continued to do my job meticulously, professionally. Let them make the next move. Then, one rainy Tuesday afternoon, an unexpected email landed in my personal inbox. The sender's name, Marcus Thorne, stirred a vague memory. The subject line was simple. "A quick question, confidential." I opened it, curious. Marcus Thorne. He'd been an internal auditor for the trust briefly, maybe 7 or 8 years ago. A sharp, quiet man who had left rather abruptly. I remembered being surprised at his departure. He'd seemed very competent. His email was cautious, almost cryptic. He said he'd been doing some personal financial archiving and had come across some old notes related to his time at the trust. There was something he felt in good conscience he needed to mention to me given my long-standing role and, well, my family connection. He asked if I might be free for a discreet coffee. A knot of unease tightened in my stomach. This felt significant. We arranged to meet the following day at a small out-of-the-way cafe, far from the usual orbit of the trust and my family. Marcus was older now, grayer, but his eyes were still as keen as I remembered. He got straight to the point after minimal pleasantries. "Grace," he said, his voice low, "when I was reviewing the trust's accounts back in, I think it was 2016, I came across a particular set of transactions related to your grandmother, Eleanor Senior's estate." My grandmother. She'd passed away when I was in my late 20s. A formidable woman, but kind to me. I'd been told her estate was modest, mostly tied up in sustaining Mother's old family home, which the trust now partially used for events. "She left a specific bequest for you," Marcus continued, looking directly at me. "A not insignificant sum of money. It was to be transferred to you upon your 30th birthday. I saw the documentation. The will was very clear." I stared at him. My 30th birthday. That was over a decade ago. I had never received any such sum. I'd received a small sentimental jewelry box and a collection of her favorite books. That was it. I don't understand. I stammered, my mind reeling. There must be some mistake. There was no mistake in the will, Grace, Marcus said gently. I remember noting at the time that the funds seemed to have been absorbed into the trust's general operating revenue around the time you turned 30. There was a series of internal transfers, justifications about streamlining donations and maximizing foundation assets. At the time, I flagged it as unusual, but I was relatively new, and your mother, well, Eleanor, assured me it was all above board. An internal family arrangement you were aware of. My blood ran cold. An internal family arrangement I was aware of? That was a lie. A blatant, despicable lie. Shock, sharp and icy, pierced through me. Betrayal so profound it left me breathless. This wasn't about them taking advantage of my generosity, my willingness to give. This was theft. Outright, calculated theft of money that was legally, rightfully mine. Money from my grandmother, who had wanted to provide for me. And my mother had orchestrated it. Had looked Marcus Thorne in the eye and lied. Heartbreak followed swiftly on the heels of shock. It wasn't just about the money, though the sum he mentioned was indeed significant, enough to have changed the course of my life back then. It was the casual cruelty of it. The depth of the deception. My own mother robbing me of my grandmother's legacy, and then allowing me to continue pouring my own money into their lives, into the trust for another decade, all while knowing they were sitting on what was mine. I didn't know. I whispered, the words catching in my throat. The coffee in front of me was untouched, growing cold. The clatter of cups and quiet conversation in the cafe faded into a distant roar. All I could hear was the echo of Marcus's words, the shattering of another deeper illusion about my family. Marcus nodded slowly, his expression sympathetic. I suspected as much. That's why I kept my notes. I left the trust not long after, partly because of things like that. A feeling that not everything was as it seemed. He slid a thin, unmarked envelope across the table. These are copies of what I found. The relevant sections of the will, the internal transfer memos I could access at the time. It's not a complete picture, but it's a starting point. I picked up the envelope. It felt heavy, freighted with a truth I wasn't sure I was ready to face. But I knew I had to. The hurt was a raw, gaping wound now, far deeper than the sting of being asked for another $60,000. This was a betrayal that cut to the very core of who I thought my family was, and who I was to them. Just a name on a will, whose inheritance could be conveniently repurposed. The quiet power I had felt in saying no was now overshadowed by a sickening cold realization. I hadn't just been a resource, I'd been a mark. After meeting Marcus, I felt numb. Then a slow, cold anger began to build. Not the explosive kind, but a deep glacial rage. The kind that clarifies rather than consumes. I knew I couldn't do this alone. The thought of confronting my mother and sister with this, of wading through more of their lies and manipulations by myself, was exhausting before it even began. I needed help. I needed someone I could trust absolutely. My mind went to an old college friend, Sarah. She was a forensic accountant now, sharp as a tack, incredibly discreet, and most importantly, completely removed from my family and the trust. We hadn't seen each other in years, but we'd kept in loose touch. I called her that evening. "Grace Holloway," she said, surprise and warmth in her voice. "To what do I owe the honor?" I took a deep breath. "Sarah, I need your help. And I need you to be very quiet about it." We met the next day in her city office, a sleek and personal space that felt a world away from the cozy, cluttered rooms of the Holloway Educational Trust. I laid out Marcus Thorne's documents, told her the whole story, from the 15 years of financial support to the recent $60,000 request, and finally, the missing inheritance. Sarah listened intently, her expression becoming more serious with every word. She didn't interrupt, just occasionally made a note on a legal pad. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair, her gaze thoughtful. "Grace," she said, her voice calm but firm, "this is bad. Potentially very bad for them. What Marcus gave you is a smoking gun, but we need the full arsenal." And so began what I started to think of as the silent accounting. For the next few weeks, Sarah and I worked discreetly, meticulously. She knew how to navigate the labyrinth of financial records, how to find the trails that had been deliberately obscured. Because I was still technically the trust's financial officer, I had access to the internal servers, the historical data, the board meeting minutes they probably thought no one would ever scrutinize with this kind of lens. Sarah guided me on what to look for, what to download, what to piece together. Late nights became my norm. While my family slept, presumably content in their righteousness and my new pariah status, I was in my small apartment, surrounded by spreadsheets, scanned documents, and the quiet hum of my computer. My gray eyes, usually just tired, now held a new kind of focus, an unwavering resolve. It was like assembling a giant, ugly puzzle. We traced the funds from my grandmother's estate. Just as Marcus had said, they'd been diverted into the trust's general revenue. But it was what happened next that truly took my breath away. The money hadn't just been absorbed. It had been systematically siphoned off over several years through a series of cleverly disguised programs and grants. There was the Clara Holloway Emerging Leaders Initiative, which had an impressive-sounding mission statement but whose primary beneficiary, after tracing payments through two shell organizations, appeared to be Clara Holloway herself, funding a lifestyle far beyond her modest trust salary. Large consulting fees paid for vague services. Inflated invoices from preferred vendors who, with a little digging, turned out to have personal connections to my mother. My mother and my sister. They were at the heart of it. Not just complicit, but the architects. The documents, the emails, the sign-offs, their names were everywhere. They had used the very mechanisms of the nonprofit, the mission of education and charity, as a smokescreen for their personal enrichment, using my stolen inheritance as their seed capital. The cold clarity was absolute. There was no room for doubt, no possibility of misunderstanding. It was all there, in black and white, in meticulously documented transactions. The sense of betrayal deepened, but it was now overlaid with a kind of grim determination. My old belief, if I carry enough, they'll love me for it, felt like a cruel joke. They hadn't just failed to love me. They had actively, systematically defrauded me. Sarah was a rock through it all. She was methodical, unemotional in her analysis, which helped me stay grounded. "They were sloppy in places," she commented one evening, looking over a particularly damning set of invoices. "They got comfortable. They never expected anyone to look this closely, especially not you." And that was the crux of it, wasn't it? I was Grace, the quiet one, the responsible one. The one who always paid, always fixed things, always looked the other way at the minor discrepancies. They had underestimated me. Profoundly. By the time we were done, we had a comprehensive file. A detailed accounting of every dollar of my inheritance, how it was taken, and where it had gone. My moral resolve had solidified into something hard and unbreakable. This wasn't just about getting my money back. This was about truth. It was about accountability. The silent accounting was over. Now it was time for them to hear the figures. The file Sarah and I compiled was thick, damning, and irrefutable. It detailed not just the initial sum of my inheritance, but years of accrued interest, calculated at a reasonable, legally defensible rate. The final figure was substantial, more than enough to make them sit up and pay attention. For a week I just sat with that file. I didn't act immediately. I needed to be sure of my next step. Revenge, the hot, satisfying kind you see in movies, held no appeal for me. That wasn't my nature. My power, if I had any, had always been quiet, underestimated. I thought about going to the authorities, to the trusts board directly. But Sarah had advised a different initial approach. "Give them a chance to make it right," she'd said. "It strengthens your position if they refuse." So I drafted a letter. Not an emotional plea, not an angry tirade. It was a formal letter of demand, addressed to Eleanor Holloway and Clara Holloway, in their capacities as fiduciaries of the Holloway Educational Trust and as individuals. Attached to it was a summarized version of our findings, clear, concise, and utterly damning, and a detailed invoice. The invoice for my stolen inheritance plus interest. The letter stated the facts, referenced the supporting documentation, and concluded with a simple demand. The full amount specified in the invoice was to be repaid to me within 30 days. If not, I would be forced to pursue all available legal remedies, including reporting their actions to the State Attorney General's office, the IRS, and the full board of the Holloway Educational Trust, complete with the entire dossier of evidence. The implications for them personally, and for the trust's reputation and charitable status, were left unstated but were perfectly, chillingly clear. There was a certain silent satisfaction in preparing that package. My hands were steady as I printed the letter on good quality bond paper, as I made sure every page of the summary was perfectly aligned. This was me, Grace Holloway, the financial officer, the one they dismissed and defrauded, using my own skills, my own precision to call them to account. My calm strength felt absolute. I wasn't afraid. I was simply ready. I didn't deliver it myself. I didn't want to see their faces, not yet. I didn't need to. I sent it via a bonded courier service, requiring signatures upon receipt. One copy to the trust's main office, addressed to them jointly. Separate copies to their home addresses. I imagined the courier arriving, the formal envelopes being handed over. I imagined the moment they opened them, the casual curiosity turning to shock, then perhaps to panic, as they read the words, as they saw the numbers, as they realized that the quiet, responsible Grace had finally found her voice, and it was speaking a language of cold, hard facts they couldn't ignore or dismiss. The 30 days began to tick down. I went about my life. I still went to my job at the trust, though the atmosphere was now thick with an unspoken tension that was almost palpable. They knew. I could see it in the way my mother's smile became brittle whenever I entered a room, in the way Clara actively avoided eye contact, her usual ebullience completely gone. But neither of them said a word to me about the letter. Not directly. It was a silent, high-stakes game of chicken. and I was content to wait. The power for once was mine. The letter they didn't expect had landed, and the silence that followed was filled with their fear, not mine. The 30-day deadline I'd set in my letter was approaching. The silence from my mother and sister remained absolute, at least towards me. But the ripples of that letter, the one they didn't expect, were already spreading outwards, with a momentum all their own. I didn't have to lift another finger. Their own actions, their own panic started to do the work for me. About a week after they received my demand, I heard through a junior staffer at the trust, the kind of person who is often invisible but sees everything, that my mother had called an emergency, closed-door board meeting. Only a select few senior board members were invited, the ones she presumably thought were most loyal to her, or most easily manipulated. The agenda was vaguely described as urgent financial restructuring. I wasn't invited, of course. I was the threat they were trying to contain. Then things started to get messy for them. The Holloway Educational Trust, despite its internal issues, had always maintained a fairly pristine public image, largely thanks to my meticulous financial management and careful handling of donor relations over the years. We had two major institutional donors, philanthropic organizations that contributed significantly to our annual budget. Suddenly, one of them, then the other, announced they were pausing their funding, pending a review of the trust's governance and financial oversight. No one told me why officially, but rumors travel fast in the small world of Vermont nonprofits. Whispers of financial irregularities, of internal disputes spilling over. Perhaps Marcus Thorne, my initial informant, had discreetly shared his concerns more widely after I'd reconnected with him. Or perhaps my mother, in her panicked attempts to shore up support or discredit me within the board, had inadvertently let something slip. Whatever the source, the damage was immediate. The loss of those two donors was a significant blow, not just financially, but to the trust's reputation. And Clara, oh Clara, her carefully curated image of the passionate, dedicated young leader began to unravel spectacularly. There was a local community awards dinner, an event the trust co-sponsored. Clara was supposed to give a speech. According to attendees I spoke to later, people were now reaching out to me, quietly, cautiously. She got halfway through her prepared remarks, her voice trembling, then simply broke down. Not a few graceful tears, but a full-blown, incoherent sobbing fit at the podium. She mumbled something about betrayal, and people trying to destroy good work, before being led off stage. It was public. It was humiliating. And it was entirely of her own making. Through all of this I said nothing. I did nothing. I continued to go to my office, perform my duties with quiet diligence, and watch. There was a strange, almost detached feeling as I observed the consequences of their actions unfold. It wasn't triumph I felt, not exactly. It was more a sense of inevitability, like watching a tower built on rotten foundations finally begin to sway and crumble under its own weight. Justice, it seemed, had its own momentum. My letter had been the catalyst, the first small stone that starts an avalanche. But the destructive force came from their own choices, their own greed and deceit, built up over years. The pressure on them must have been immense. The public scrutiny, the nervous board members, the sudden drying up of funds. The 30-day deadline was ticking closer and closer. I didn't need to threaten or cajole. The truth, once released, was doing its work. The silent satisfaction I'd felt in sending that letter had transformed into something else. A profound understanding that sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is to step back and allow people to face the natural consequences of their own behavior. I had spoken my truth. Now the world was reacting to it, and I just had to wait. On the 29th day, just before the deadline expired, a check arrived. Not by courier, not with any accompanying letter of apology or explanation. Just a plain bank draft delivered by regular mail to my apartment, for the full amount specified in my invoice. Every last cent, including the accrued interest. My mother and Clara had chosen to pay. They had chosen self-preservation over a protracted, public, and undoubtedly career-ending legal battle. Holding that check, I didn't feel a surge of elation or a desire to gloat. What I felt was quiet, a deep, profound sense of quiet. It was the sound of a long, bruising chapter of my life finally closing. The money wasn't a windfall, it was a restitution. It was the reclaiming of something that had been stolen, not just financially but emotionally, my trust, my security, my belief in family. I didn't return to the Holloway Educational Trust. My resignation, brief and professional, was on my mother's desk the same day the check cleared my bank account. There were no farewells, no exit interviews. I simply walked away. From the ledgers, the hushed manipulations, the suffocating weight of their expectations and deceptions. With a portion of the settlement money, I did something I dreamed of for years. I bought a small, secluded cabin on the shore of Lake Champlain. Nothing grand, just a simple, sturdy place with a wide porch, surrounded by trees, where the loudest sounds were the lapping of water against the shore and the call of loons at dusk. I spent weeks there just being, reading, walking in the woods, watching the light change on the water. My thick brown hair, which I'd always worn tied back so tightly, I now often left loose, letting it catch the breeze. My gray eyes, which people had always said looked tired, began to lose some of their weariness, reflecting the calm of the lake. The healing was slow, but it was real. It came not from revenge, but from release. From reclaiming my story, my resources, myself. The old wound, the belief that I had to carry everything to be loved, was finally beginning to scar over, replaced by a quiet understanding that true worth isn't about utility, but about integrity. Several months later, an email appeared in my inbox. It was from Clara. It was short, hesitant. She said she was sorry. Not for the theft, not explicitly. More for how things turned out. She asked if we could talk, maybe meet for coffee. For old time's sake, she wrote. I thought about it for a long time, sitting on my porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. The anger was gone. The bitterness had faded. What remained was a kind of gentle sorrow for what could have been, but also a clear-eyed acceptance of what was. I replied the next day. My email was also short. Clara, I wrote, thank you for reaching out. I appreciate the sentiment. For now, though, let's keep it simple. I wish you peace. And I meant it. I truly wished her peace. But it was a peace I knew she would have to find on her own, just as I was finding mine. There would be no more coffees, no more chances for the old dynamics to reassert themselves. The closure wasn't in reconciliation, not in the way she might have hoped. The closure was in my ability to wish her well, genuinely, and then to let go. Completely. The freedom of walking away wasn't just a physical act of leaving a job or a toxic family situation. It was an internal liberation. The freedom to define my own life, my own worth on my own terms. The quiet strength I had found in saying no had blossomed into a quiet, resilient peace. And that, I realized, was the most profound victory of all. My life now is simpler, quieter. I still do some freelance accounting, enough to live comfortably. But my days are measured more by the seasons changing over the lake than by spreadsheets and deadlines. I've learned that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's the quiet resolve to protect your own peace, to honor your own truth. The cost of being the responsible one was far too high, but the reward for reclaiming myself? That has been priceless. If this story hit close to home for you, if you've ever felt that particular ache of giving everything and being seen as nothing more than a means to an end, please leave a comment. I may not reply to all of them, but I promise you I read every single one. Your stories, your experiences, they matter. And if you've ever felt something like this, or if you just find a connection in these narratives of quiet resilience, consider subscribing. We share more stories like this every week. Stories of ordinary people finding their strength in extraordinary circumstances. And finally, if you'd like to support the channel through Super Thanks, thank you. Sometimes giving, when it comes from a place of true generosity and connection, can be part of healing too. For all of us, thank you for listening.